I hope you all brought your serious faces today because we are talking about a grave topic. Hello friendos, this is Chain. Welcome you back to Chain of Commander. It is time for our monthly visit to the base of operations where we talk about ways to make your mana base work harder for you. One of the new cards from the recently released Kaldheim set, Port of Carfell, got me thinking about lands that help fill your graveyard for decks that want to have a big graveyard. I started thinking and doing some research here, and I thought I was able to rummage up a pretty solid list of lands that we can use to help keep those graveyards stocked. So let's get into this list here, and let's start with that Port of Carfell. Port of Carfell is part of the uncommon land cycle from Kaldheim. It enters the battlefield tapped, adds blue mana to the mana pool, and has an activated ability of 3 blue, black, tap Port of Carfell and sack Port of Carfell, mill yourself 4 cards, then you may return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Now, a lot of decks that are about filling their graveyards are doing so to reanimate big creatures, and Port of Carfell is entirely about that game plan. First, it's helping you mill 4 of your cards to add to whatever you already have in the graveyard. And then it can return any creature for essentially 7 mana. The 6 mana to pay for the activation, as well as the mana you lose for tapping Port of Carfell as part of the cost. It also has the benefit of resolving all at once. So let's say you have one of the Eldrazi Titans with the shuffle trigger on it, such as Ulamog the Infinite Gyre. If that is one of the 4 cards that you mill, its shuffle ability goes on the stack, but you get to return a creature before this ability is done resolving. So you would be able to return that Ulamog the Infinite Gyre to the battlefield and then just shuffle the rest of the graveyard away once you are done. That said, the fact that you need to sacrifice Port of Carfell is part of the cost, and the fact that it enters the battlefield tapped does make this a pretty slow effect, especially if you do have ways to bring it back from your graveyard. You'd have to wait a whole turn cycle before you get to use it again. So you probably will only be able to activate this once, maybe if you're really lucky twice within a game, but because its cost of opportunity is pretty low, I can see this fitting into many blue-black re-animator strategies out there. The next card I wanted to talk about here is a card that I think actually has a lot of things in similarity with Port of Carfell, but with a couple key differences, and that is Sequestered Stash. Sequestered Stash is a land that came out of Kaladesh. It adds colorless to your mana pool and has an activated ability of pay 4, tap, and sacrifice Sequestered Stash, mill yourself 5 cards, and then you can return an artifact card from your graveyard to the top of your deck. As mentioned, there are a lot of similarities with this and Port of Carfell, but there are also some key differences. First, it enters untapped. Second, it itself does not have color identity. And third, instead of creatures to the battlefield, it is artifact to the top of your deck. All 3 of these abilities have their benefits. First, entering untapped means that you can use this ability right away. And if you have a way to consistently bring this from your graveyard back to the battlefield, this is an effect you can do multiple times throughout a game without much waiting. 2, the fact that it does not have color identity means that this can go in so many more decks. In fact, when I think of artifact re-animator, artifact recursion, red is the color I normally associate with that. I'm thinking of things like Feldon and Duretti. These are the kind of decks that would like to see this sort of effect in them, and because it has no color identity, it can slot nice and easily into those decks. And third, the fact that it puts it from the graveyard to the top of the deck, it kind of slows you down a little bit. It's not as impactful as just instantly having a creature on the battlefield, but it does mean that you get to recurse any artifact out of your graveyard that you might not want there at this given time. So definitely a pretty useful tool for our artifact synergy based decks, and love to see it. For the third card we look at today, we are going to take a gander at Dakmor Salvage. Dakmor Salvage enters the battlefield tapped, it produces black mana, and it has an ability called Dredge 2. this might be the most unassuming card on our list today. While all the other cards we're going to talk about have activated abilities to fill our graveyards, this one here does not. It has the Dredge ability. Essentially, the Dredge ability, in this case, let's say Dakmor Salvage has Dredge 2. If Dakmor Salvage was in our graveyard, whenever we go to draw a card for whatever reason, we can choose to not draw that card and instead mill ourselves 2 for the Dredge 2 to return Dakmor Salvage from the graveyard to our hand. Now, because of this, to get the value out of it, you gotta get 2 things. First, it needs to get into your graveyard in the first place. Luckily, a lot of graveyard decks have incidental mill in them that can result in this card being in our graveyard. Second, if it's a effect that you want to get multiple uses out of, you need to be able to find a way to discard the card. So, in a lot of cases, you need to have many discard outlets or wheel style effects to help with those discards to help get that Dakmor Salvage into the graveyard over and over again. But in worst case scenario, I'd like to think of Dakmor Salvage as being a incremental mill that you really only need once, because when I am going to mill, or when I'm going to dredge back Dakmor Salvage, it's in an effort to make sure I hit my land drops. So keep that in mind. That said, we're about halfway through this list here. How have you folks been liking it so far? If you've been liking it at all, definitely, hitting that like button there just to help with that YouTube algorithm. And, I'd appreciate any help you can get to help get these videos out there. Let's keep going. For our 4th card today, we are going to go all the way back to OG Innistrad and take a look at Nephalia Drownyard. Nephalia Drownyard taps to add a colorless to our mana pool and has an activated ability of 1 blue-black and tapping it to mill target player 3 cards. Nephalia Drownyard is probably the cleanest, simplest, most straight-to-the-point form of graveyard fill we have on our list today. No fancy reanimation tricks, no sacking it to get the effect, just simple, repeatable mill at a cost of 1 blue-black. Now, remember for graveyard decks, milling itself is tantamount to drawing a card in most situations. So if we think about Nephalia Drownyard as being the 4 mana, the 3 to activate it and the 1 to tap it, 4 mana to draw 3 cards for yourself, that return is actually pretty standard. And now you're going to put it on a land versus on a spell. It also has the additional benefit of being able to target any player. So, if somebody says, let's say they cast Vampiric Tutor, they put a card on top of their deck that they intend to draw, you can use Nephalia Drownyard to force them to mill that card away. This is a clean, efficient land with very limited drawback and a lot of utility that should really go into pretty much any blue-black graveyard synergy deck. Now, the next card we're going to talk about here is actually a card I've brought up on this channel before, back when I did my Base of Operations segment regarding the Deserts of Amonkhet. The one we're going to look at today is Ipnu Rivulet. Ipnu Rivulet came out of the Hour of Devastation set. It's a land desert. You can tap it to add colorless to your mana pool, or you could tap it to make blue mana, but you do need to pay 1 life to do so. And last, it has an activated ability of 1 blue, tapping Ipnu Rivulet and sacrificing a desert to mill target player 4 cards. These deserts, these utility deserts back from the Amonkhet block, were some of my favorite ways and a major source of inspiration to this whole segment to begin with. But out of all of those, I think Ipnu Rivulet might be individually the most powerful when put into a proper environment. It comes in untapped, which means you can use this ability right away. It can produce colored mana if needed, but also uncolored mana if you don't need colored mana at that time. And it is a technically repeatable effect. The cool thing about this whole cycle was that these cards would require you to sacrifice a desert to get their effect. However, even though Ipnu Rivulet itself is a desert, it does not need to be the desert you sack. Now, if you're in a pinch and it's the only desert you have access to and you really need to mill 4, go ahead. Mill the Rivulet. But if you have other deserts in your deck, you can mill those instead. And if you have an effect like a Crucible of World effect where you can play deserts from your graveyard, play lands from your graveyard, you can keep bringing back those deserts to sack again to Ipnu Rivulet to keep the mill going. And once again, like Nephalia Drownyard, this particular card can target any player. So once again, you can mess with people's top decks if you really need to. This card, Ipnu Rivulet, this is the card on this list that I play the most in most of my decks because it is such a low opportunity cost and it's just so good at what it does. Try it out. All right, we have 2 lands left to talk about here, and they are by far the oldest lands that we are going to talk about today. So let's start with the second oldest here. Let's save the oldest for last, but let's talk about Cephalid Coliseum. Cephalid Coliseum is from Odyssey. It has tap, add blue to your mana pool. Cephalid Coliseum does 1 damage to you, and has Threshold, pay blue, tap, and sacrifice Cephalid Coliseum. Target player draws 3 cards and then discards 3 cards. Now this Threshold ability here. This requires you to have 7 or more cards in your graveyard already before you can activate this ability. So unlike the other cards on our list, this can't really help get the graveyard going. It can only help an already established graveyard get bigger. And second, unlike every other card that we've talked about so far, this card does not mill directly. Instead, you're going to be drawing cards and then discarding cards. There are pros to cons to this in general. First, pros, if you have a card in your hand you want to get in your graveyard, this is an excellent way to get that card into that graveyard for you. Second, as far as cons are concerned, it doesn't mill. So graveyard commanders that care specifically about milling, I'm looking at things like Sidisi Brood Tyrant, there's no way you can get a trigger off of Sidisi Brood Tyrant with this card. Now, similar to Port of Carfell, Sequestered Stash, and whatnot, you do need to sacrifice this as part of its cost to get its effect. But because this enters untapped, and because its cost of activation is so low, if you have a Crucible Worlds effect out there that you can bring this back every turn you can be drawing an additional 3 cards and very quickly dig through your deck to get the cards that you want in your hand into your hand and the cards that you want into your graveyard into your graveyard. A very useful tool, very powerful tool at a very cheap recursive mana cost makes this a very powerful effect in many decks. So, like I said, we have one last card to talk about. It's the oldest card, and boy, is it a doozy. But before we get to it, I do ask, if you've been enjoying this list so far, definitely consider hitting that subscribe button. I'd love to have you folks join us going forward, and I'm sure you would love the content that we put out on a regular basis. All right, folks, do you have an absurd amount of money? Do you have the incessant need to flex really hard in a casual format? Well then, Bazaar of Baghdad is going to be the card for you. It is the ultimate graveyard filling machine. Bazaar of Baghdad, originally printed in Arabian Nights, simply says tap to draw 2 cards and then discard 3 cards. Like with Cephalid Coliseum, this does not mill. It draws and then discards. But unlike Cephalid Coliseum, which draws you the same amount of cards that you discard, this one you're actually going to be discarding 1 more than you draw. If you take this card and introduce it to somebody whose Magic career is just starting, they might look at this and be like, wow, that card is bad. It's essentially card disadvantage. But remember what we said earlier. In the right decks, cards in your graveyard are an extension of cards in your hand, which means the drawing the card and the card in the graveyard, the discarding, is tantamount to each other. They're essentially the same thing. You're essentially drawing 2 cards. Also, this plays very, very nicely with the dredge mechanic we discussed earlier because it helps put dredge cards in your graveyard and also helps get the dredge cards back into your hand. And because it's ordered draw the cards first, you can return the dredge cards to your hand and then just discard them right away again. This is an excellent way to start digging through your deck, filling up your graveyard. But it's very, very, very expensive. It's on the reserve list, which means this card will never see a reprint ever again. It's incredibly rare. Arabian Nights was not printed that much. So copies of this right now, I think, are selling for roughly $5,000 for 1 copy. Is $5,000 worth it for this effect in our format? I cannot answer that question for you. I am not a financial advisor, but let's just say I don't think any Magic card is worth taking out a second mortgage on your home for. So, that said, I want to hear from you folks. I want to know if there are any lands I missed that help fill up your graveyard. If so, stick them in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. And while you're down there, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Love to have you folks join us going forward. Beyond that, thank you very much for joining me today. This was a pretty cool topic to talk about, and I hope to see you guys again in the future. Take care.